Hello, and welcome to another in our occasional series of local history programs presented by the New Jersey Room, the local history department here at the Jersey City Free Public Library. My name is John Beekman. I'm department manager here in the New Jersey Room. Joining me today is Dr. Jean Housen, who will be telling us about the findings of an archaeological study of an area impacted by the reconstruction of the Tonelli Circle and Pulaski Skyway approach a few years back. This cultural assessment of the area, sponsored by the New Jersey Department of Transportation, resulted in a 4-volume set of findings and is the subject of an exhibit here at the Priscilla Gardner Main Library in the stairway landing between the second and third floors. Jean Housen is principal archaeologist at NV5, an engineering company with offices in Parsippany, providing environmental compliance services, mainly for New Jersey transportation projects. Dr. Housen holds a PhD from New York University, and her research ranges from Caribbean plantation sites to rural New Jersey, but with special expertise in urban archaeology. She has been involved in the largest excavations ever conducted in both Jersey City and Newark, as well as having worked for several years on the analysis of the African burial ground in New York City. So thanks, Jean, for agreeing to be with us here today and talk a little bit about the archaeological site, the Covert Larch Neighborhood, and the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railroad yard, and to tell us a little bit about what's in the exhibit that is viewable on the second, third floor landing of the Priscilla Gardner Main Library. So now I'll just turn the forum over to you, Jean, and you can tell us about your site.
Thank you, John. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to get started right away so that I can get through everything. Kind of a lot to cover. And I really, really enjoyed working on the exhibit and I've wanted for years and years and years to do an exhibit on these, especially the Covert Larch Neighborhood. And I finally got my chance. Thank you very much for that.
It's been a long time coming, so thank you.
I'm very happy to be here. To talk about the archaeology we've done in the West End of Jersey City. And I'm going to try to go through this in about a half hour. So let's get started. One thing I really like to do is orient myself in space when I'm talking about an archaeological site. So this is Google Earth view of Jersey City. The arrow is pointing to the library downtown. And the sites that I'm going to be talking about are to the northwest, across the Bergen Ridge, these two sites outlined in red. This is where we've been working on archaeological projects for many, many years. And because they're roadway projects, so all roads lead to Tonelli Circle, so there we are. The two sites are part of the city known as the West End. Before that, it was Hudson City. Hudson City was added to Jersey City in 1870. And this aerial photograph from the early 1930s shows the two sites at that time. So one of the sites and the second site. So you can see the Hudson River all the way in the background and the New York City skyline. And at the lower right, you're looking at the brand new, at the time, Pulaski Skyway coming in to this aerial photograph. So we're going to learn a lot today about these two sites that are outlined in red here. There are two Department of Transportation projects that resulted in the archaeological excavations. The archaeology is done as part of the DOT's environmental compliance, and an exhibit about the sites with photographs of the excavations and artifacts that were recovered was installed at the Jersey City Public Library at the end of January 2022. And today's talk is basically a virtual version of that. I'm going to talk about each project in turn, starting with the 1-9T new road from St. Paul's Avenue to Secaucus Avenue project. It's a mouthful. This project is currently under construction in the early phases. And the idea is that the roadway will parallel Tonelli Avenue, in theory, hopefully relieving some of that awful congestion. So archaeology kicked in when research showed that a small engine repair yard once stood at the corner of West Side Avenue and St. Paul's Avenue. And that particular location is going to be impacted by road construction. The yard belonged to the New York Susquehanna and Western Railroad, and it was built in the West End neighborhood in the early 1880s. This map shows the railroad. In 1891, it served northern New Jersey and extended to Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, and Middletown, New York. It connected along the way with many other railroad lines. It wasn't one of the huge rail lines like the Erie, but it was pretty big. And as any rail fan will tell you, quite storied. All railroads are quite storied, according to rail fans. And this is no exception. So it operated until 1913. So it was about a 30-year span that it was in operation. And it was one of many rail yards in Jersey City and Secaucus, because that's where all of the nation's railroads converged before entering into or crossing the Bergen Ridge on their way to the Hudson River waterfront. As you can see, though, so this is the rail yard we're going to be talking about. And it was really tiny in comparison to some of the other ones. For instance, this enormous Erie yard that was close by, it's all shown in pink on this map. It just dwarfs the NYS&W rail yard that we're talking about. It had a giant roundhouse with a huge turntable, acres of trackage. But it's really interesting to me to look at one of the smaller operations and kind of see how that worked on the ground. And that's what archaeology helps us do. The other giant rail yard nearby is Croxton Yards up in Secaucus. We also excavated that one. That's another story for another day. So the former rail yard, it had been used for 100 years for other purposes, mostly in the late 20th century and recently for vehicle storage, restaurant storage. It was a junkyard, and most recent as a rock and gravel yard. Some small test excavations a few years ago showed that remains of the buildings from the railroad were still under the surface. So once it was purchased by DOT and cleared out, or kind of cleared out, sort of cleared out, the archaeologists took over. So a machine was used to strip off the paving and the upper layers of soil that had been dumped on top of the remains of the railroad buildings. And then archaeologists start clearing off with shovels and trowels. And then they record what they find with measured drawings and photographs. And ultimately, we were able to expose the entire foundation and inside features of the really large engine repair building. It was like 170 feet long. It was kind of a huge archaeological excavation in terms of area. It turned out that the building contained 2 repair bays with these really nicely, it was very nicely built. It had these arched brick floors in each of the repair bays, which helped with drainage. I mean, they were cleaning and repairing locomotives in here, so that would have worked really well. And in the western of the 2 bays, we found a wheel drop pit, and that's what the arrow is pointing to right there. And a wheel drop pit is kind of exactly what it sounds like. They would bring a locomotive into the repair bay and position the wheel carriage over the wheel drop pit. And there were these rails under it, so you could slide under it, and you could slide, if you needed to, for instance, replace the wheel carriage or take it out and make repairs, you could do that, because you had to be able to get underneath the locomotive to do that. In addition, the archaeologists were able to identify at the far northern end of the rail yard the turntable. And these are the 2 things that sort of make up a rail repair yard. You have to have a turntable so that you can turn your locomotive and send it into the repair building, and you had to have the repair shed where you would actually do the work. So this was kind of a minimalist facility, but it had what it needed. It had a turntable. There wasn't a roundhouse around it. It had a turntable, and it had a 2-bay repair shed. So what you can see here, I'm showing you in yellow, the dashed lines is if you can make it out, is the outer curved perimeter wall of the turntable, and the little spokes I'm showing you coming off it. There was a little rail around the perimeter wall that the trestle rode along, and then measuring over to what we knew had to be the very center of that circular area was a rectangular base, concrete base, for the pivot mechanism that was used to turn the trestle that carried the engine. So if you can picture it, the engine was on a trestle on the turntable, and it could be turned to either go off onto a siding or down into the repair bay. So these are the remains we found of the turntable. There's no way we could have exposed the entire thing because it would have taken a month, but we got the information we needed from exposing this much of it. And this is a diagram we did for the exhibit showing a map of 1910. And we put on this the steps so that you can kind of follow the sequence of operations at the yard. A locomotive was taken off the track onto a siding, maneuvered over to the turntable, positioned on the turntable. Once the engine was cooled, because they were coal fired, right? It was hot. Once it was cooled and the ashes were emptied into an ash pit, it would be directed into one of the two repair bays, depending on what it needed, what kind of maintenance, what kind of repair, whether a wheel carriage needed to be removed. And so you could position the locomotive either, with the front facing in or the front facing out, because you had a turntable. So you could position it how you needed to, depending on the repairs. So the historic maps like this one, they show the general layout of the yard, but they don't really show any of the details of the interior. Like that big yellow building is the repair shed. Well, we didn't know what was in there until we dug it and saw it. And we had a couple of tours of the site for the State Department of Transportation to take a look at what we had found. It was pretty impressive. So the archaeology really told us a lot about how this rail yard worked. All right, I'm going to turn now to the other project, which is this was the 1 in 90 improvements project that included replacement of the St. Paul's Avenue viaduct and the construction of new ramps off the Pulaski Skyway, right? And that project required the demolition of an entire neighborhood of homes. So this is a close-up from that 1930s aerial photo I showed you earlier, showing this little neighborhood. You can see all these houses. It was like this separate little enclave, and it's kind of cut off from other streets by the railroad and by this new highway and factory buildings. So it's just this little neighborhood that kind of stayed all by itself and lasted for a really long time until they really had to do this road work. And they demolished all of the houses. It stood on the north side of, if you know the area, it stood on the north side of St. Paul's Avenue and included 1 block along Covert Street and 1 block along Larch Avenue. So we the archaeologists, we started calling it Covert Larch after those 2 streets, and it really stuck and it became the Covert Larch neighborhood. And that's sort of the name of the site that it goes by. Now, neither of those streets no longer is in existence any longer because the whole thing was demolished. So Covert Larch is going to be one of those names. It's like, what did that come from? But it came from the names of the streets that used to be there. The archaeological work took place in phases over many, many years, starting with early research on the area and culminating in the production of a 4-volume report, which was submitted in 2014. The homes themselves were built in the mid to late 1800s, many before sewers had been laid in the streets, okay? And why am I telling you that? That's really important for archaeologists. We like to find houses that were built before sewers were available, because what that means is that you might find abandoned outhouse pits in the backyards. We call them privies. It's just a pit under an outhouse. And once the house no longer needed its outhouse, they would use those pits as trash receptacles. So they fill them up with household trash, which is sort of the bread and butter of archaeological research. So we like to look for those houses. So we wanted to find houses where there would be privy pits in the backyards. And we started looking in these backyards. We used a machine to help us look. We know where to look. They're always in the very back corner of the yard, right? So we looked, and that's exactly what we found, privy pits. These are all emptied out already after we did our excavations, but it was fascinating. Some of them were unlined, just pits in the ground. Some of them were lined with planks. some with stone and some with brick. And I'm telling you, the variation in this tiny neighborhood of types of privy pits was really interesting. It was amazing. So we think that this privy construction, backyard infrastructure construction, was pretty idiosyncratic, and it was done by individual builders. Though having said that, in 1870, when it became part of Jersey City, there were city ordinances, so you had to follow certain rules. So in this neighborhood, we had some privies that were dug, built, whatever you want to call it, before 1870, and some that were after. And the more substantially built ones were the ones after it was incorporated into Jersey City, and they had some ordinances in place that they had to follow. So this is at 96 Larch Avenue, and I wanted to show you, when we dig a privy pit like this, it's filled with debris and dirt, and so there's nothing nasty in there. But we dig it really carefully, one half at a time, layer by layer, and that way we can keep track of the layers of soil and the artifacts that are in those layers. And we develop a sequence over time, so we can kind of look at, like, over time, this was filled, into separate deposits, and they might tell you something a little bit different about each time period. So you can see sticking out of this wall, because we dig in nice straight walls like this. That's archaeology. You can see bottles sticking out, little pieces of dishes sticking out. So we would leave them in place until we were ready to dig that half of it, because by then we would know exactly what the layers were, and we could dig the second half a lot faster than the first half. So I'm going to talk, it would just be impossible to review all of the information that we were able to gather about the families that lived in this neighborhood and their material goods. It's a lot, but I'm going to focus on the three topics that are in this exhibit at the library, starting with what I call the small things of everyday life. Now, the families that lived in this neighborhood, Covert Larch, they were working class families, and they would have spent most of their earnings on the basics, right? Housing, food, clothing. But the archaeology lets you get a glimpse of, other aspects of their daily life in this period. And I'm going to show you some of the things that we find that sort of bring these families and bring these householders kind of more to life than just the bare bones of their economics. For instance, toys. Now, mass production, we're talking late 19th century here, mass production, starting in the early 19th century, even made many kinds of new goods, including toys, affordable for working class Americans, okay? For instance, the neighborhood girls had these dolls. These are called frozen Charlotte dolls, and they're tiny. They range in size from, like 2 inches to maybe the size of your palm. And they were just one piece, they're porcelain. I've never worked at an urban site that I didn't find these. They were really popular. And we found them in all the backyards. We also have this miniature crockery, probably also girls' playthings. And you'll see later in the presentation, they look exactly like mom's kitchen dishes that girls would play with. These are some of the toys that we found in all of these backyards. And other kinds of toys, that kind of ran the gamut. There was a little toy watch face, a different kind of doll, marbles. Well, always marbles, right? Because we're digging in backyards. And I like to think that what might have started out as children's individual collections of marbles very quickly ended up spread throughout the neighborhood, because they would get exchanged, wins and losses. They would end up all over the neighborhood. So what you get is marbles from every house that are kind of all the same kinds of marbles, because these kids played with each other. That's what we can assume. Sometimes you get an unusual piece, like at the lower left here, there's this sulfide marble. That's a marble that's made of glass. It's large. I don't play marbles, so I don't know what you call that. It's a big marble, but it's clear glass, and embedded in it is a little porcelain figure, in this case, a lion. And that might have been some kid's prized possession in this neighborhood. And then on the right also, I'm showing you all of the children in the neighborhood attended school, from the time they were 6 into their teen years. And we know that from the census records. The census tells you, if children were in school. So we know from the age of 6 until the time they could go out to work, these kids were all in school. So what we find are slates and slate pencils at their homes, and that they used to use them for writing practice, the kids that were in school. Instead of a pencil and paper, you had a slate and a slate pencil, you could use it forever, over and over again. Harmonicas. We recovered harmonica parts from 6 different homes in this neighborhood. I don't think these were toys. I think that they might have been played by musical men in the families, maybe by kids as well, but they weren't real inexpensive. This example here was made in Germany. It's marked, so we know a little bit about it. But like I say, 6 different homes had harmonicas that ended up in the trash because they didn't last forever, or people moved out. Maybe they got lost, but they probably got broken. We find things in pieces, like you see on the left. Even if we find it whole, like on the right, by the time we clean it up and everything, we take it apart, it's in pieces, but we can take a picture of it, put it back together. Another thing archaeologists almost always find, especially from this time period, are clay smoking pipes in household trash deposits. They were thrown out when they were either broken or no longer wanted, or again, somebody was moving house, cleaning out. They were inexpensive goods. These were imported in mass quantities from England, Scotland, and Germany into the United States. They weren't produced here, but they were not expensive. Millions of these were imported into the United States. Pipes that were made of wood or meerschaum pipes were much less common at these archaeological sites, and at most. And it's partly a preservation issue, but it's also they're more expensive. They were more expensive at the time. So you would expect more clay pipes in a working class neighborhood. But I think that men's choices about how to smoke might have also been related to their middle class aspirations. So you had a railroad engineer and a railroad yard master living in this neighborhood, and they smoked these briarwood pipes. But there was also an Italian immigrant family, and these guys smoked the briarwood pipes also, along with clay pipes. And I think that they were maybe signaling their aspiration to middle class status, partly by some of the things that they bought, that they used their money on. A couple other kinds of things that we find that kind of fills in the picture of people's expenditures on sundries, if you will, cologne, shoe polish, grooming items like this. Again, we're not talking about expensive cologne here. The one on the left is Hoyt's nickel cologne, and it's exactly what it says. It costs a nickel. The one next to it is a Floriston cologne bottle, and we've seen it advertised, so we know this was the 25-cent size. So that's kind of the expenditure that you're looking at, items like that. People always ask me, oh, did you ever find gold? And once in a while, it's pretty rare. I'm not working at really wealthy people's sites usually, but you find a few things. The person who lost this ring in the 1890s probably belonged to one of 3 Italian immigrant families who lived at 77 Larch Avenue. So they had this gold ring, but let me tell you that you could buy these from a Sears catalog. They weren't real expensive. But this family was really interesting because they had those briarwood pipes, and I found a ring there. I think so. One thing you need to know is that nativism at this time led to the exclusion of Italians from a lot of higher level jobs. Like, it's not like they could just go to work for the railroad and work their way up and be an engineer or a yard master. That wasn't going to happen, right? They were going to be a laborer. But these families in this neighborhood, there were several houses that were occupied by Italian immigrant families, and they persevered, and they ended up owning their homes. They had ways of affording that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Ballos, who were in this house where that ring was found, ended up opening a grocery store in 1910. The Masonic pin on the right was probably owned by this railroad engineer who lived at 23 Seaman Avenue. That Seaman Avenue was the next block over, but their backyards backed up onto the large backyards, so we excavated those also. And he belonged to the Jersey City Freemasons, Eagle Lodge number 53, and he was in line for high priest. But this is not something he would have thrown away any more than you would throw away that ring. But if it got lost and swept up and dumped in the backyard trash heap, you would never find it again. But we found it. And that's a little tiny gold piece. It's tiny. I put it next to the ring so you could see that, it's smaller than the ring. It's tiny. Easy to lose, unfortunately. And I think that's what happened. So many of the houses in the community were shared by at least two families. Like I mentioned, those Italian families. The owners, their tenants, and owners and tenants both also took in single men as boarders, right? So if you owned a house and you had to pay your mortgage or whatever, you rented out half of the house, probably one family on the top floor and one family downstairs. And you also rented out rooms to boarders. And this is a way of making extra money. And those single boarders usually were laborers that worked in the rail yards or in factories. Two of the homes that we studied were single family homes, just two. And they belonged to men who worked in the high paid railroad jobs of yard master and engineer. And the other thing you need to know is that older children, when they went out to work 14, 15 years old, and their jobs, they contributed their wages to the household also, and that helped make ends meet, including girls who might work in factories in their teens. But in this neighborhood, none of the women who were married worked outside the home. They were responsible for keeping the home and child rearing. None of the married women had jobs outside of the home. This is to give you just an idea of, we have records on what railroad workers would have been earning on an annual basis. And each of these jobs is represented by one of the houses that we studied. And I put them in order by, how much they made, right? So the yard master made the most, then the engineer, ticket agent, fireman, car inspector, and then at the bottom, the laborers who were making, in the 300s per annum. This is their yearly income. And, we can look at households based on this and try to compare them, but it's tricky because sometimes a laborer had tenants and boarders and 3 children also bringing in their wages. So we can't just go by the head of household. It just doesn't work because people put together household finances by getting as many contributions from as many sources as they could. And we spend a lot of time looking at documents as well as digging in the ground. And one of the things we start with is the census. So this is just, we look at a lot of manuscript census pages like this and figure out what they say. These are the 3 Italian families that lived at 77 Arch Avenue. And the census takers always got the Italian names wrong. So from one census year to the next, it would be spelled completely differently. And you had to try and figure out, is that the same family? And usually you can, but it was a problem, with translation. Something, one of the many things archaeologists have to dig through is documents like this. So archaeologists, we could be working in ancient Egypt or Jersey City, but the things we always find are ceramics and glass because they don't decompose in the ground. So we're always going to talk a lot about dishes. The families living in this neighborhood used very plain white earthenware dishes for their meals. This simple style was extremely popular in America in the late 1800s. This was the look. This was what working class families, middle class families in cities. This is the dishes they used on their dinner table. Some families, like that engineer's family, had a little bit more money. They were able to buy an entire set of these white dishes, like in the top picture. But most of the families didn't buy their dishes that way. They bought them piece by piece, like open stock, as they could, I guess. So that we had one family that had 8 identical little white plates, and each one of them had a, if you flip a plate over and look at the maker's mark on the back, it tells you what factory made it. Well, they had 8 different factory marks on these dishes. They were not buying them as a set, they were buying them piece by piece. And I think that's just something that people with limited means had to do, but they wanted the same style of dishes as their more middle-class neighbors. They got them. And alongside those plain white dishes were these fancier glass vessels like little bowls and wine glasses, pitchers, sugar bowls, with these pattern glasses, designs on that. They too were really affordable for working families, and Sears catalogs were one way to shop for them. And in the exhibit, we have a Sears catalog. The library has Sears catalogs from the 1800s. We have on display one of them open to a page selling sets of glass dishes just like these. They might have sat on a shelf most of the time, rather than be used for meals, but they were really pretty and they were really affordable, and all of these families had them. And then they had purely decorative items also, including, and I have to show this because it's so unusual, this black, on the upper left, it's like a sugar canister, and it has this Fisher boy on the top and the catch of the day on the side. I've never seen anything like it. So it's an unusual piece, which we wanted to show in the exhibit. Flower pots. We found flower pots in every single backyard. And again, you could buy them anywhere. And the Sears catalog on the right, I'm showing here, had suggestions for how you could display your indoor plants, and they would sell you these plant stands. And it's in this period. This is a Victorian period, right? Middle class homes were into celebrating the natural world. They had shells, flowers, plants, taxidermy, stuffed animals in their homes. When you think of a Victorian parlor, they had stuff like that. But by the 1880s, the potted plants were enjoyed in working class homes as well. They seem to signify like you're close to nature, it's nature, godliness, a healthy home. So again, we found these in every house in the neighborhood. Okay, finally, I call the next topic family medicine and public health. This is a topic that I've been interested in for like 40 years, my whole career. I look at it as the intersection between what people do in their own families and homes to address sickness and health, and the measures taken or not by cities to provide safe water and waste disposal. So starting with medicines, working class families use medicines prescribed by doctors and also patent medicines which were sold over the counter as cures for all kinds of ailments. They often came in bottles that had the name of the product and the name of the company embossed on the bottle, right in the glass. So we can tell what was in them. And we look at different kinds of bottles for clues about how individual families dealt with sickness. The so-called regular medicines, the medicine prescribed by doctors, were often in unmarked bottles and vials. So we find those too. We can compare the percentage, the frequencies of different kinds of medicines. But doctors prescribed these patent products also. They cured everything. In this example, this was for teething or colicky babies, right? Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was a national brand, and it contained alcohol and morphine sulfate. It would definitely put your child to sleep. It might have contributed to infant deaths in this period. And up until 1906, with the Food and Drug Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, manufacturers didn't have to disclose anything about what was in their medicine. All people knew was, well, either it worked or it didn't. And if it worked, it was probably because of the alcohol or the sedative, the morphine content. But we also show in the exhibit a few examples of these trade cards, what you see on the right here. And they are little cards about the size of a playing card or a baseball card. And they were produced by medicine makers and distributed by druggists. So it was advertising for these various medicines, and people could collect them. And they were pretty little cards. They made all kinds of claims on the back about what they would cure. This is Dr. Jane's vermifuge. It's a worm medicine. You take it if you had worms. But there's a pretty little picture called the Talking Well. It's a little seduction scene, and on the back of the card, it gives you all kinds of information about what this drug could fix. And you name it, they would cure anything. A couple of other examples. I just like the names. Arabian tonic blood purifier, the Safe Nervine. I'm going to quote to you from the advertisement for that. It was, quote, a pleasant, harmless preparation to be used in connection with Warner's other products in cases of general debility, sleeplessness, nervousness, irritability, etc., and for headaches, rush of blood to the head, and general nervous prostration. There is no better and no safer remedy in the market. So a little swig of that, and you're good to go. Now I'm going to turn to the public health aspect of this topic. Jersey City built a water system pretty early in the 1850s. And they pumped water from the Passaic River up to the reservoir on the ridge, where it could then be distributed by gravity throughout the city. The St. Paul's Avenue Viaduct construction project, one of the two DOT projects, required the excavation of a portion of the original pipelines that came in from the Passaic River. And archaeologists had the opportunity to go down in the hole, take a look at these, measure them. They pulled them out. Some guy from United Water, a collector, took one of the pipes. People collect all kinds of things. And we were excited to get a look at them because we had done a whole study of this waterworks system, and we got to see the original pipelines. The one on the left was the original, and then the one on the right was the second one, but they were both very early. During the period of time when the neighborhood and cities in general, during the period of time when water was available in the streets, in the pipes in the street, right? But sewers had not yet been built in the streets. There was the water was a boon, but it created a problem for homeowners because they're bringing water into their house and they end up with wastewater. Like they might even install a toilet in their house, right? Because they have running water, but there's no sewer, right? So it was up to them to find a way to get rid of the wastewater in their own backyard. This is a backyard water collection cistern that was originally built to collect water runoff from the roof that got converted into a cesspool. Probably, this was 79 Larch Avenue, and probably the home hooked up to water, city water, but they didn't have a sewer connection for like another decade. So they had to figure out how to deal with it in the backyard. And let me tell you, we saw some really interesting arrangements in these covert larch backyards. People were dealing with it because they wanted the running water, and they found a way to deal with the waste. To be more serious, water quality was a really serious issue, and it could be a life or death issue. So typhoid fever plagued Jersey City in the late 1800s. And by the 1880s, both chemical analysis of contamination and common observations, like things like dead animals in the reservoir, the influx of sewage, putrid smells, discolored tap water, led to a public outcry. So even though at that time, the precise mechanisms were not understood or couldn't really be demonstrated for disease, right? The link between bad water and disease, typhoid fever in particular, seemed really clear to both scientists and the general public. And I love this graph that the City Department of Public Works put this out in 1929 to show how their good work in providing safe water for Jersey City had reduced the death rate from typhoid. So the bottom bars of the graph are the early years when they were getting their water out of the polluted Passaic River. And they were getting their water from a point in the Passaic that was downstream from sewage that was being introduced into the river from Newark. So it was definitely the source of the typhoid fever. But in 1896, they got a temporary water supply from upstream. And then in 1904, they got their own new water supply, their new aqueduct from their very own reservoir out in the Jersey City Reservoir that got its water from the Rockaway River. So where you see this sudden drop off in typhoid death rates, it's 1897 when they stopped using the Passaic River. And then in 1904, when they started using their water from the Rockaway, it never went back up. And they were able to show this by making a graph. And one other point I want to make here, Jersey City in 1908 started treating their water with chlorination. Jersey City was the first city in the country to do that. And it worked. And their really, really low levels of typhoid, are testament to that. And other cities immediately started following suit. It was a really simple thing that could be done to make drinking water safe. Good for Jersey City. In the meantime, though, we think of bottled water as a modern fad, right? With all these plastic bottles of water. In the late 1800s, lots of city water supplies, not just Jersey cities, were really unreliable and often not potable. They were not suitable for drinking. Contaminated well water or piped water, whatever. It came from a polluted source. It could contain disease organisms. It could even kill you, right? So bottled water, I see as one other way that a family could protect its health. And there were many, many bottlers of mineral and soda water in America and in Jersey City. And we found bottles from all of them in all of the backyards. This is just a partial list, but these are the Jersey City bottlers that were represented. And one of them, the one I'm showing, is from Steinberger's. And as kind of a bonus for us archaeologists doing our research, we find a bottle that has the name of a company and an address. Well, we take ourselves over to the Jersey City Public Library, to the New Jersey room, and we look through the old city directories and find out when the business was operating. And we follow them back and forth through the directories and get precise dates for those water bottles, which is, it's hard for us to get precise dates for anything, but, thanks to the city directories, we were able to do it for all of these bottlers. And so that's kind of a bonus for us when we find bottles like this that are local. Okay, finally, in closing, I just want to let everybody know that the work done for the 2 New Jersey Department of Transportation projects that we've been looking at resulted in formal reports that are on file with the New Jersey State Historic Preservation Office, but they are also available in the Jersey City Public Library in the New Jersey room. So anybody who is interested in the vast amount of detail that I was not able to cover in today's presentation can certainly look at these reports, and they have full inventories of all of the artifacts that we covered, analysis of the sites, and lots of historic research. So there might be of interest to some people, even if you're not interested in reading the technical reports. If you could get a chance to get by the library and see the exhibit, it's usually worth doing because it's fun and it's interesting to see the artifacts themselves rather than just pictures of them. And there are a lot more than I was able to show you today. So I urge you to get over there and look at the exhibit if you get the chance. It's in the display area between the 2nd and 3rd floors of the library. I hope you get there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your listening to this, and I hope that you have learned something.
All right, Jean, thank you so much for that. That was really a wonderful window into life a century and a half ago here in Jersey City. You're very good at explaining the work that you're also very good at doing. I know from experience. Certainly that Jersey City Waterworks study has been invaluable. The folks at the Preservation Alliance who deal with that reservoir up in the Heights rely on that. And of course, all the rail fans that you mentioned and call out enjoy the work that you create. Just a couple of things that struck me about this and about the report. I mean, you really do talk about, this creating a window into life of as the working class is moving into the middle class. And I mean, when you talk about those terms, that's kind of mixing scales, which is something that's a political science a question. But it is really interesting to see that. And you do explain that well in your talk in the exhibit. And I was also liked how you mentioned, archaeology. When we think about archaeology, maybe the lay person, or if you said archaeology, I would think of, the pyramids or, prehistoric times. And, really people maybe who casually think about it don't know that you can actually study relatively recent times in that. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you went from learning archaeology and then applying it in this, specific way that you have done. I mean, folks would also know that you did work in the African American burial ground in Lower Manhattan. That's certainly a very important project that you were part of. So if we could just tell us a little bit about the career path of an archaeologist and how you, instead of going overseas to dig up pyramids and ziggurats, you're out here at the Tonelli Circle.
Yeah, so I did do some work overseas, but it was in the Caribbean, and I was working on sugar plantation sites. So that's my other area of expertise. But most archaeology that gets done by professional archaeologists is what I call in the talk compliance related. So we're working on projects where environmental laws that were passed in the 1960s require builders, state agencies like DOT to look at environmental impacts of their work. And that includes cultural resources as well as environmental resources. So archaeology falls into that and under that umbrella. So the way I always explain it to people is when you're doing professional archaeology, you get what you get. And I've worked on New Jersey Department of Transportation projects that we ended up looking at 5,000-year-old, pre-contact period Native American sites. I've looked at rural taverns, and I've looked at urban backyards because it depends on where they're building the roads. But I got interested in urban archaeology very early in my career when I started graduate school because of I worked on a site in Greenwich Village actually in a summer once, and I got really interested in this whole question about health and hygiene and how people had to use these backyard facilities, and they had to wait for the city to put a water pipe in their street. And in the meantime, there were all these medicines flying around that were doing no good. It just struck me as a really interesting subject and something that could be studied through urban archaeology. So I got really interested in urban archaeology. And when the two major these projects and another major project in Newark came our way, I just jumped right on it with enthusiasm, because I just had this interest in not so much urbanization, the process of urbanization, but how people lived in cities that were growing exponentially in the second half of the 19th century and earlier. I mean, I've done a lot of work on the colonial New York City in the colonial period. It's just a fascinating subject. And as much as we know from the documents, there's something about, looking at people's, even though it's their garbage, it's stuff from their actual house and their daily life. It's what you see when you go to a historic house museum. The museum gathers together a bunch of stuff that they find all over eBay to put in these period rooms and stuff like that. And this is a little more, to me, it's like you're looking at stuff that's associated with these really specific households that you come to know you do all this research on them, and you come to know the families, and you know how many kids they had, and you know when they grew up and when they got married, and you're looking at their stuff. And sometimes you feel kind of a voyeur looking at their stuff because they didn't know you were going to be looking at their garbage, right? But it's just it's, I think, a unique window into what city dwelling was like in certain periods of time that are. It's a formative period of time. This late 19th century urban, you know, the immigrants. We've looked at sites where you go from the Irish and the English and the German immigrants, and then towards the end of the century, the Italian and Eastern European immigrants, and you can compare them, and you can look at the differences, but you can also look at what was emerging as this like American version of, you know, what a household is supposed to look like, you know, and how it's supposed to work, and what kind of dishes you're supposed to have. It's a thing that actually happened, and you can see it in the ground and in the stuff.
It's striking how much, you know, as you that mass culture that you tie into the Sears catalog. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that, you know, when I was a kid, you know, we might go to a shopping center or a mall. I'm a you know, suburban New Jersey kid. Mm-hmm. But here we are now a century later, and we're back to online catalogs things that come through the mail.
Just do it online, you know, I know, right?
It's fascinating.
It has like a homogenizing effect, you know. I mean, these dishes you could look at an assemblage of, you know, dishes that were excavated in Jersey City. I can compare it to the stuff from Newark or from downtown New York. If it's the same period of time, it's going to look the same. It's amazing. It's almost scary, you know, to see that degree of homogenization, because that was a style that it was important to people to fit in, and I think in particular for immigrants to have the stuff that would make them fit in. So this was an easy way to do it.
It's really having these artifacts and explaining them this way and tying them into that infrastructure of commerce really makes real. I mean, we talk about this Americanization process, or we know about Ellis Island and the immigrants coming in, and you know, that process of becoming American across the 20th century, you know, whatever that means. Yeah. But these, you know, this seeing it displayed in objects really does give it sort of a presence and a more visceral understanding. I mean, these are things that in the traditional history that we have here are maybe looked at just through demographics or numbers. So this sort of view into the daily lives of people and tying that into this really specific group is really valuable. I was struck also now in that 1930s picture, that neighborhood was very isolated. It wasn't always quite that isolated. Is that right? Because I have to go and look at the older maps, which is something I love to do. But I think what happened was there was some building over there, but then as the Pulaski Skyway first came in, and the railroads built up earlier, you know, more and more of that neighborhood got isolated, and that
it really did get cut off. It was always kind of surrounded by railroads on two sides, but once the highway came through, and then, you know, the factory was there first, also the American Can Company, but it was definitely much more connected to the streets further to the south. It just, as always, highways cut off neighborhoods. They just do. And this neighborhood survived for a really long time after the Pulaski Skyway, I mean, decades. But it didn't survive the 1 in 90 improvements.
Well, I tell you, as someone who has occasional need to get from the boulevard to the Pulaski Skyway, it is still extremely difficult, but better than it was.
Is it so? Good to know. Honestly, it just seems to me like There's nothing they can do. Maybe this new road will help. The real answer is public transportation.
Right. And I mean, I think, and this is getting slightly off topic, but maybe people who don't know that this is the Pulaski Skyway is a highway built by railroad engineers who didn't understand how car traffic would work because we didn't really have those conventions yet. So like ramps coming in from only one side or, shoulders, things like that.
Cars were slower back then too.
Yeah.
And there were fewer of them.
Yes. But that's as you said before, a topic for another day. But I just really want to thank you for this. It's been a long time coming. We've been talking about this project since you were doing the work, and then since the work was completed.
I have to say, the first thing we do is start researching a location to see, what's the archaeological potential. I think I first showed up at the New Jersey room in like the late 1990s, start looking at this neighborhood. One of the first things I did was go to the records of when water and sewers were installed in the streets, because that's like kind of a starting point for us. But the records are there. So we were able to do that and narrow down. So you're not digging holes in a place that you shouldn't be. You can target your archaeology. And it was so wonderful to walk in there and say, oh my God, the records are there. That was it. So I feel like I go back a long way with New Jersey.
Longer than my time here, apparently, but I remember it. So again, thanks again for this wonderful exhibit and for this talk and for your kind words about the department in your talk. If any questions come in through the YouTube channel, I will pass them along to you, and we will try and put responses in the comments. So feel free to put questions in the comments box here on YouTube. And just thanks again, Jean, and we'll look forward to the next project.
You're very welcome. Thank you for everything.